All right. Gaza War Day 458. No end in sight. You may have seen that Hamas sent a very detailed counterproposal back to the mediators, which I assume Netanyahu will be rejecting shortly. Um, I will say that I guess one of these days I'm gonna be surprised and have egg on my face when one of these days, presumably one of these ceasefires will actually end in a ceasefire, but I don't think today's is the one. Meanwhile, in Gaza, more fighting. Israel's taken several losses today. One of their units apparently withdrew from the north, so they're just pathologically continuing their same pattern they've done for the year and a half, I guess, year and 3 months, where they go in and they have a unit go in and destroy hospitals and massacre people and take trophy photos and make TikToks and then um, commit atrocities and then withdraw after taking some casualties. I saw reports you guys have seen in terms of the genocide report. They let chicken. They hadn't let any chicken or meat in, and they let some chicken in, and it was of course poisoned. So people died after eating poisoned meat. Another classic genocidal story. We have some of those in Canada actually too. The doctor from Kamal at one hospital is still missing. I think they are saying they don't know where he is or whatever. So who knows what other um, horrific things they're planning to do there. They're on to the next hospital. They've basically destroyed all the hospitals, most of them multiple times. You've probably seen sexual violence testimonies of Israeli soldiers committing sexual violence against Palestinians. Totally insane stories that I've seen, though no longer surprising. Meanwhile, if you guys saw on Electronic Intifada, Ali Abunimah from Electronic Intifada just published a story on that site on EI, the headline of which is Israel still can't find any 7th October rape victims, prosecutor admits. I'm sure they'll tell you more about that on Thursday, but they they have the central claim that of their atrocity propaganda a year and 3 months later has absolutely no evidence for it. And that's by a prosecutor, an Israeli prosecutor who Ali notes wants to have the death penalty for people who stole avocados on October 7th. That's probably a crime for which there is documentation. There were probably Palestinian citizens in Gaza who crossed the fence and stole avocados. I've also seen testimony of Palestinians um, taking bananas. The bananas were with permission. Okay. You may have seen low key tweeting. There's something interesting. I think it's worth kind of talking about a little bit because I think there are some things going on with the politics of the global politics of Israel, let's call it, um, that are worth getting into. Something interesting. You guys, I'm sure everybody who knows me knows low key. Low key's a very, very active, very energetic, very talented um, person who raps. He's based in the UK. He's got a huge media footprint and podcast called The Watchdog, and he does a lot of great investigative work. And he did something I think really, really interesting here. He he's using his account to try to do some sleuthing. So he says here, an individual from Gaza who was kidnapped in Sde Timan for 33 days, that's the Israel's torture prison, um, has identified the Israeli soldiers circled in the picture as someone responsible for torture in the camp. So there's these demonstrations. These are all people going to work, I think, and there are Israeli demonstrators who are telling them to refuse to serve, and they take pictures and video of them, and some of them are, war criminals with lots of evidence that they're war criminals. And so that's a it's a fascinating thing, when you look at the way the Israelis use technology to target Palestinians and social media to try to target Palestinian supporters. It seems that there are there's some of that medicine that could be brought back on them, especially if they insist on posting their crimes to social media, which they do, which is a lot of what they like to do. And so um, I think I think this is an interesting development and an interesting kind of thing, social media phenomenon. And maybe they'll just shut down social media to try to prevent this. I don't know, but Israelis like to use social media, so it's hard to imagine that they'll be able to shut this down easily. This kind of work and this kind of sleuthing. It's an interesting development. There's another interesting development by someone who called Tamim. You may have seen Tamim's account on Tamim Olive Fern is the account. And Tamim had this thread. They posted this thread where they were showing how there's a guide for Israeli soldiers on how to not get arrested while traveling, what to check before the flight. So soldiers who, and it's a Q&A format, soldiers who post videos online provide hostile organizations with potential evidence to support suspicions against them. How can I check if my destination poses a risk? Well, look up human rights organizations, universal jurisdiction. Consult an international criminal law expert before you travel. You guys, imagine having to check with an international criminal law expert before traveling. What precautions should they be taking? Some countries might treat seemingly minor content, such as racist songs, as incitement to genocide, but avoid posting photos and videos, especially content showing destroyed buildings, even if there is a military justification. They point out they can't defend you. They don't have the money to defend you. Funding one soldier's defense could set a precedent requiring similar support for others accused of serious crimes. Will things get better? Will traveling become safer after the fighting ends? The threat may not diminish and could even intensify as Gaza opens to human rights groups and foreign journalists. And this was all spurred by a case in Brazil. Someone in Brazil brought this case against a war criminal, a suspected war criminal, Israeli war criminal. And this Israeli fled to Brazil, fled from Brazil to Argentina. So as Tamim said, if all else fails, run to Argentina. Argentina being a safe haven for fascists, for sure, especially today, but historically as well, as people may know the history after World War II. One of my favorite doomers, Ori Goldberg. You may remember him from previous sit reps. I often bring up Ori Goldberg's Twitter account. He has this very interesting, very pessimistic view of where Israeli society is going, and he talks about high school. I'll show you the thread as we read it. He says, I read an interview with the principal of Tel Aviv's High School for the Arts, known as Talma Yalin. The school was the cradle of many an artistic career. It is not overtly political, but artists often lean left. The principal says he does not allow teachers to speak about the genocide other than when discussing the tribulations of the Israeli side. Any attempt to suggest the Palestinians are suffering is incendiary. He is not being actively stifled. He can do more. He's not interested. It isn't just the fear. People in his position reflect more than they initiate. Israeli society is reforming with the genocide at its core. There's no repression. This isn't an extremist government. It's the old or new normal having risen to the surface. So we are not crazy or diabolical. The apocalypse we have wrought is our now gray, institutional, mundane default. So that's another interesting thing. Seems like, again, doesn't seem super sustainable to me. But just because it's not sustainable, it doesn't mean it can't go on for a while. I always go back to this quote by the English imperialist, but the famous English economist who said a lot of interesting and insightful things. I think John Maynard Keynes had a pithy way of quoting, despite being, you know, definitely an English imperialist of his time. But he said, you know, they were talking about he emphasizes like short-term cycles and how to get an economy going when it's in a depression. That was a lot of what Keynes was interested in. And there was one of the counter arguments to what he was doing was that they said, you know, in the long run, the economy will go to some kind of equilibrium. And he used to say, in the long run, we're all dead. So the short term matters more. And of course, you know, when you're talking about a genocide and a war, every day counts. But the long run prospects of a society like this are not good, to say the least. Okay, so in the West Bank, there's a pogrom in Qalqilia, and it's a real pogrom, as I believe Ori Goldberg himself commented. Unlike the Amsterdam settlers are running, Israeli settlers are running around setting fire to Palestinian homes and vehicles. There are, speaking of setting fire, the Palestinian Authority are also setting fire to houses as collective punishment. So they're just following exactly what the Israelis are doing. They're obviously being egged on to try to fight the Israelis' battles for them. And Israel, I'm sure, loves to see this. You know, this is a major ongoing front of the conflict, Janine, the battle between the resistance and the collaborationist Palestinian Authority. Okay, Yemen. Yahya Sari is back. He made an announcement that the newest aircraft carrier, U.S. aircraft carrier, the Harry Truman, which has arrived to replace the two previous aircraft carriers that have left the Red Sea. This one is the new one, the latest one to come. Harry Truman hit with targeted with 2 cruise missiles and 4 unmanned aerial vehicles in the northern Red Sea, while the American enemy was preparing to launch a large attack on our country. So this is something that the Ansarallah, the so-called Houthis, seem to be getting really good at, which is, you know, if their accounts are to be believed, and I should say I do believe them, that they are getting pretty good at figuring out when the Americans are about to attack them and hitting them as they're about to attack, or at around the same time, or just before or during. And this takes a lot of know-how, a lot of ability, and a lot of experience, which they now have. You know, they have the most experience probably in the world at this point fighting the U.S. Navy. Who else has experience fighting the U.S. Navy besides Ansarallah? And so this is amazing what they're doing. You know, really beyond anything that you could ever imagine anyone doing in terms of the timing and everything else. So yeah, we'll see how that we'll watch that develop. You know, I should say I can't remember who announced it. Probably Abdul Malik Al Houthi, who said they're over 700,000 people that they've trained up to fight now over the past year and a half. So I remember hearing last year numbers like 200,000 and thinking that was big, but this is, yeah, they're getting big. You know, the militaries, the numbers of soldiers that are arrayed that are getting ready are growing, if anything. Hezbollah made a similar announcement that they have more troops ready than before. That and I mentioned in my previous sit rep that Hamas has said something similar, that they've replenished their manpower, their forces with thousands of more fighters that are trained up. And, fighters that are trained during the battle, that's a whole different school. That's a whole different level of preparation. And so this is incredible. These are all very, very major developments, and who knows where they're going to go in the future. Okay, Hezbollah I mentioned a couple of days ago. Naim Qassem, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, he made a speech about a half an hour commemorating the martyrdom of Muhandis and Qassem Soleimani, the the Iranian general who was arguably the architect of the so-called Axis of Resistance and their military alliance. And he talked about Soleimani, and he talked about the war with Israel and the ceasefire and a couple of interesting points. I mean, it was absolutely not the speech of an organization's leader that is like planning to surrender. So there have been 1,000 violations by Israel of the ceasefire. Israel's still destroying houses. They've announced that they're planning to stay. And it was on the Lebanese state, it was on the Americans and French to guarantee the ceasefire. And the ceasefire has been violated 1,000 times. And what Naim Qassem said, though, was that he said, don't waste any energy worrying about when we're going to respond. We're going to respond on our schedule, more or less. I'm paraphrasing, but he said, when we respond, we're not going to talk about it. You'll know that we've responded because you'll see it. And he also said that they will not be tolerating any presence of Israel anywhere in Lebanon. So, and he said that resistance, he reiterated this message that all of the axis of resistance people say, like Houthi said it last week, that the only guarantor of your freedom is resistance, and it has to be resistance, and it's the only way. And he pointed, like Houthi did, to Syria. He said, if you don't think that's the case, look at Syria. Look what Israel's doing in Syria, where they're not being resisted. So all of this tells me that this is all signaling that there's a good chance that the war is going to resume. I think the sneakiest, or like the cheekiest, or I don't know how to put it, the most, Hassan Nasrallah like thing that Naim Qassem said was, he said, we're gonna decide when we respond. And he said maybe it'll be before 60 days, maybe it'll be after 60 days. Maybe we'll run out of patience. We'll run out of patience when we run out of patience, basically. So he's not, it's not giving Israel any, anything they can plan by, where they can say, well, we can screw them over until the 60 days is up, and then maybe we'll have to change our behavior or not. But there's Naim Qassem said, maybe it'll be before, maybe it'll be after. So I think there's, based on that and based on Israel's behavior, I think there's a chance that they will end up going back to war after the 60 days, or even before, like Naim Qassem said. The thing is, both sides needed the ceasefire when they needed the ceasefire, but I don't think Hezbollah can tolerate a long-term occupation of South Lebanon by Israel. And I also don't think that Israel can help themselves. So I think that this is probably going to go back to war. In the Cradle, I read an analysis in the Cradle, very compelling analysis that said the ceasefire will probably hold. It was before this speech, but I guess we'll see. Speaking of Syria, so Syria will make the war. If the war starts again, Hezbollah could very well face an invasion from the south, from Israel, at the same time as being invaded from the east by HTS, right? I mean, I think there's a, I, you know, I don't think I don't see any reason on this channel to pretend that HTS is not working for Israel. Of course, HTS is working for Israel, but HTS has a big job, and it's overplaying its hand. They're oppressing all the minority groups of Syria. They're uh, boarding up churches and desecrating religious sites and massacring, killing people on video, torturing people on video. So they're and they're not that big. They're a group of mercenaries. They're supported by Turkey. They are they were certainly very successful when the Syrian army was not resisting them, and the Syrian army no longer exists. And that is one of the best things that HTS has going for them. They also are perfectly happy not to fight any invaders, which also enables them to conserve their strength for oppressing the local population. But even then, this is not a force that I think is big enough to even occupy the big cities between Aleppo. I mean, Aleppo's close enough to Turkey that Turkey can always um, get there in a pinch. But in terms of occupying Homs and Hama and Damascus long term, and then trying to go and oppress the minorities in the West on the coast, and trying to go and help the Israelis out in Lebanon, this is getting to be a lot for a mercenary organization with no roots, nothing to offer the population. They're not even going to get sanctions lifted. They're not even going to get the oil and wheat back from the American occupied areas. They're not going to get their territory back or the arsenal. They've just given the water control of the water supply away to Israel. So this is not going to be a very compelling project. And to rule Syria long term, I think you have to control the coast, the outlets to the sea, the resources of the hinterland, the oil, the wheat, and the cities and the industrial areas of Aleppo. And you have to have good relations with your Arab neighbors. And so I'm inclined to think that at some point in the medium term of years, there's going to have to be a reinvention of the Ba'ath Party. They're going to reinvent the wheel, and they're going to reinvent the Ba'ath Party of Syria, which is an inclusive Arab nationalist project with some kind of socialist economy that involves provisioning the population with all kinds of public goods in a developmentalist way, and territorial sovereignty and integrity. It's probably the only way to rule Syria long term. So yeah, Syria is divided now, and it's carved up, and maybe it'll stay that way, but it might not be as easy even to keep it carved up as it looks right now. So Rania Khalek made a really good point in a tweet the other day. where she was talking about the sanctions and how the US isn't going to lift the sanctions on Syria. And she said something like, I, meaning Rania, never wanted sanctions on Syria. I don't want them now, and I didn't want them before. And that's the difference between the people who advocated for the overthrow of Assad before. They wanted sanctions on Syria, knowing how destructive they were of ordinary people's lives. And now that their party is in power and Assad is gone, now they want the sanctions lifted. And I think that's like a really good way of describing the analytical and political difference between those of us who are what I've been calling jokingly and increasingly sincerely tankies, and those who are what I generally have called Assad must go imperialists. And the difference is, at any point in since 2011, if I had felt confident that there would be a wonderful parliamentary democracy that would have intact the entire Syria with territorial integrity and sovereignty, and the entire Syrian arsenal and control of Syria's water resources, and maybe even getting the Golan Heights back. And that would and Assad would go, and you'd have elections every 4 years or whatever it was, every 6 years, whatever whatever they wanted to do. I would love that. I would have loved that. That's why, like, the idea of that, like, those of us who opposed the destruction of Syria were Assadists. Like, Assad was a guy, an optometrist who came and ruled Syria because of his name, because the name Assad had this prestige attached to it with the establishment of Syria. It's not it's not like Marxism. Assad didn't write 3 volumes on political economy that people have poured over for hundreds of years to look for insights into the contemporary situation. There's no, like, what is us? There's no such thing as Assadism. There never was. But, like, the destruction of the patrimony of the Syrian people, and now the plunder and the destruction of what belongs to those people. It's their sovereign right. That's what we always feared would happen. That's what did happen. And that's what we always opposed happening. It's the destruction of the state. It's the destruction of the country that we didn't want. And now here we are. So because of that, because that's where we are, I wanted to tell you all about, I wanted to do a video on Syria's history, but this video is gone for a while now, and it's getting late here. So I think I'm going to stop now. But in my next video, I promise you guys, because I have the notes, it just took me a lot longer. I'm going to go through chapter 1 of A.B. Abrams's book, World War in Syria, which is really good. One of you guys is actually how I got this book. I didn't know about this book. I always recommend Charles Glass. I always recommend Patrick Steele. I always recommend Tim Anderson. But this is a really good book, you guys. A.B. Abrams, World War Syria, 2021 book. And chapter 1, it got me thinking. It had some historical background that I absolutely didn't know, and some perspectives on it that I had not thought of. So we're going to go in my next video from 1945 to the beginning of 2011, and the ups and the downs of Syria's military and geopolitical history up to that point. And I think there's a lot of connections, and in a perverse way, there's some kind of comfort in the sense that a lot of what we've seen, we've really been here before in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of insight and I don't know how to put it, ideas about how where things might go that you can see when you look at these patterns. So I will come back to you guys with that in a couple of days, probably. And in the meantime, I will leave you. Um, I will leave you with this. So hang in there. And that leaves this video actually as a relatively short one, which is good, I think. So yeah, hang in there, like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.